She was found in a ditch on a rural road in Washington state. No pants, hands bound behind her back, a single bullet wound to the back of her head. She had been lying there for 6 days before anyone stopped. The young man she had traveled with was found 70 miles away, beaten, strangled, zip ties near his body. 2 victims, 4 counties, 1 killer who left almost nothing behind. What followed was 31 years of dead ends, 200 failed leads, a detective who refused to walk away, and a complete stranger who uploaded her DNA to find her own family and accidentally broke open a case that had defeated an entire generation of investigators. This is the case that changed how the world catches killers. Before we go back to 1987, here is what you need to understand about why this case matters beyond the victims themselves. The killer left biological evidence at the scene. For 31 years, that evidence sat in a lab with a code name and no face attached to it. Then a new science, one that had never been used in a criminal conviction anywhere in the world, traced his DNA through a public ancestry database, built his family tree backward from distant relatives he had never met, and delivered his name in 2 hours. What 30 decades of conventional investigation could not do, one woman did before sunrise on a Saturday morning. This is how it happened. Tanya Van Cuylenborg was 18 years old, freshly graduated, living in Saanich, British Columbia, a quiet town on Vancouver Island. She was the kind of person who followed through. She had been campaigning to get a girls' basketball team started at her school. She had been convincing her family to adopt a dog. Her father said she would always call home if plans changed, not sometimes, always. The night she didn't call was the first night in her life she hadn't. People who knew Tanya described something specific about being around her. They paid real attention when you spoke. Not the polite kind, the kind that made you feel like what you said had actually landed somewhere and been kept. She brought a camera on this trip, a Minolta X700. She wanted photographs of their first trip together. She noticed moments worth keeping. That was the kind of person she was.
Jay Cook was 20 years old, also from Saanich. His family remembered him as warm, quietly funny, easy to be around. He had an inexplicable habit of losing his own clothes that had become a running joke in the family, the kind of detail that made people smile even later, even in the worst context. His father, Gordon, needed furnace parts collected from a supplier in Seattle. Jay volunteered without being asked. That was also who Jay was. 6 months of dating, still in that stage where you turn a supply run into a small trip just to have the extra time together. The plan was simple. Drive Gordon's bronze 1977 van to Seattle, collect the parts, sleep one night near the Kingdome, and drive home to Canada in the morning. Simple enough that no one thought to worry. Before we go further, if you're watching Cold Case Evidence for the first time, this is what we do. Every week we cover cases like this one. Cold cases, breakthroughs, the science behind how investigators finally find answers. Subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss the next one. Now, back to November 1987. On the afternoon of November 18, 1987, Tanya and Jay took the 4 o'clock ferry from Victoria to Port Angeles. They were last seen alive boarding the Bremerton to Seattle ferry at just after 10 that night. The ferry docked around 11:30. After that, 6 days of silence. Tanya always called. By the evening of November 19th, neither family had heard a word. Both the Cooks and the Van Cuylenborgs reported them missing. The search began in Canada, but Tanya and Jay were no longer in Canada.
On November 24th, 6 days after that last ferry, A man collecting bottles along a rural road near Alger in Skagit County, Washington, found something at the bottom of a steep embankment. He had found Tanya. She was naked from the waist down. Her hands were bound behind her back with plastic zip ties. She had been sexually assaulted. She had been shot in the back of the head at close range. She had been lying in that ditch for 6 days. That same day, her wallet, van keys, ammunition matching the bullet that killed her, a surgical glove, and additional zip ties were recovered beneath the porch of a tavern near the Greyhound station in Bellingham, 16 miles north. The van was found locked in a nearby parking lot. Inside, plastic gloves, more zip ties, receipts, the ferry ticket, and Tanya's black pants, the ones she had been wearing the night she was murdered. Here is what the physical evidence told investigators before any name existed. He came prepared. Gloves, zip ties, a firearm, ammunition. Investigators would later describe what he brought as a kit assembled in advance, not improvised during the encounter. This was not a decision made in the moment. The moment had been anticipated and planned for. Jay Cook was still missing. His family held on to whatever hope remained. 2 days later, on November 26th, that hope was gone. Jay's body was found beneath High Bridge in Snohomish County, 70 miles south of where Tanya was found. He had been beaten with rocks and strangled with twine and 2 red dog collars. A pack of cigarettes had been forced into his throat. Zip ties of the same type were found near his body. His black ski jacket with red piping on the sleeves was gone.
2 victims, 70 miles apart. 2 completely different methods of killing. The same zip ties, the same deliberateness, the same killer. 4 counties, King, Skagit, Whatcom, and Snohomish, and all he had left behind was an unidentified palm print on the van and biological material on Tanya's clothing. In 1987, forensic DNA analysis had only been used in a criminal investigation once before, just the year prior. Scientists extracted a genetic profile from the biological material recovered from Tanya's clothing. It did not match Jay Cook. It didn't match anyone in any database. Investigators gave it a code name, Individual A. A killer with no name, no photograph, and no record anywhere. Over the years that followed, more than 200 names crossed investigators' desks. 2 of the most prominent, both active serial killers in the Seattle area in 1987, both capable of being in the right place at the right time, were eliminated completely by DNA comparison. Each time, Individual A remained unknown. Each elimination added 1 more line to a list of dead ends that kept growing. 1 month after the murders, both families began receiving letters, threatening, disturbing, postmarked from Seattle, Los Angeles, and New York, arriving over the course of years. Someone was claiming to be the killer. In 2010, through a tip to a television crime program, the author was finally identified. A 78-year-old Canadian man with severe mental illness who had followed the case in the news and had no connection to the murders whatsoever. 23 years of investigative resources had been partially directed at a distraction. In 1995, Snohomish County Detective Jim Scharf helped establish a cold case unit. The Cook and Van Cuylenborg case was among the first files the team took on. Scharf looked at it and said what he would keep saying for the next 2 decades. This is probably the most horrendous unsolved case we have. He had no personal connection to the victims, no obligation beyond his badge, but this case lodged in him. He re-interviewed witnesses. He tracked every advancement in DNA science through the 90s and into the 2000s.
He understood one thing with certainty that never left him. The killer had deposited biological evidence at the scene, and biological evidence doesn't fade, doesn't lie, and doesn't forget. The only missing ingredient was technology powerful enough to use it. In 2003, Scharf uploaded Individual A's profile to CODIS, the National Criminal DNA Database, and waited. The result came back quickly. No match. The killer had one misdemeanor assault charge from 1984, no DNA collected from it, no trail in any system. The screen said nothing, which meant the same thing it had meant since 1987. Individual A was still no one. The families had built their lives around a question with no answer. Leona Cook, Jay's mother, was still alive, still waiting. John Van Cuylenborg had graduated college, built a career, grown older, and carried an unresolved case through every ordinary year that followed. William Van Cuylenborg died in May 1997, at 61 years old, without ever knowing who had killed his daughter. Scharf kept going. He just needed the technology to catch up. In 2017, 30 years after the murders, Scharf reached out to Parabon Nanolabs, a forensic genetics company in Virginia. Using Individual A's DNA, Parabon constructed a phenotype report, a computer-generated image of the suspect built entirely from his genetic material. Estimated skin tone, eye color, facial bone structure, age progressions at 25, 45, and 65. For the first time in 30 decades, there was a face where there had only ever been a code name. More importantly, Parabon introduced Scharf to CeCe Moore, America's foremost forensic gene genealogist, recently appointed to lead Parabon's genealogy division. Moore had followed this case for years. She was the same age as Tanya Van Cuylenborg. When Tanya was murdered, Moore was graduating high school, the same stage of life, the same moment. The case had never fully left her. She later said she felt it personally in a way she couldn't set aside. 3 years earlier, in 2015, a woman named Chelsea Rustad in Tumwater, Washington, purchased a consumer DNA test kit and uploaded her results to GEDmatch, a public database where people voluntarily shared genetic data to find relatives they didn't know they had. She was curious about her own roots. She knew nothing about Jay Cook, nothing about Tanya Van Cuylenborg, nothing about Individual A. What she also didn't know was that forensic genetic genealogy works precisely because of people like her. Unlike CODIS, which only returns a hit if the suspect's own DNA is already on file, this method doesn't look for the killer. It looks for his relatives, people who share long segments of identical DNA and have uploaded it voluntarily for entirely innocent reasons. Chelsea uploaded to find family. She found some distant relatives. One of them connected, through a chain she couldn't see, to the man who had murdered Tanya Van Cuylenborg and Jay Cook 30 years earlier.
On Friday, April 27, 2018, Individual A's DNA was uploaded to GEDmatch. Moore stayed up late checking for matches. Nothing that night. Saturday morning, 2 distant relatives of Individual A appeared in the database, both sharing enough DNA to place them in the same family branch. Moore built the family tree backward from both of them, found their common ancestors, then traced every descendant line forward, narrowing by sex, by age, by geography, until the maternal and paternal lines converged in a single family in Woodinville, Washington. The Talbots. One son, he went by Bill. 2 hours, that was all it took to do what 31 years of conventional investigation could not. The name, William Earl Talbot II. William Earl Talbot II was 55 years old in 2018, a truck driver out of SeaTac, Washington. In November 1987, he had been 24, working delivery routes through the Seattle area, the same roads Jay and Tanya were traveling that night.
He had been let go from his job a few months before the murders. No fixed schedule, no route tying him anywhere. He lived 7 miles from High Bridge in Snohomish County, the bridge beneath which Jay Cook's body had been found. His former roommate, located after the arrest, told investigators he remembered a bronze van parked outside Talbot's home on a misty fall day in 1987, a blue blanket in Talbot's house and truck, similar to one found near Jay Cook's body. And one detail that landed with particular weight: Talbot had once taken him to the same general area where Jay's body was later found. He had been there before. Forensic genetic genealogy is a lead, not a conviction. Scharf needed Talbot's DNA obtained legally, without alerting him, without grounds to compel his cooperation. The solution was surveillance. The team followed Talbot for several days. Then, stopped at a red light, a coffee cup fell from his truck.
They collected it, rushed it to the Washington State Patrol Lab that same day. Forensic scientist Lisa Collins ran the comparison against individual A. Jim Scharf got tears in his eyes when he heard the result. 1 in 180 quadrillion. That is 180 million trillion. There was no other person on Earth who fit. Individual A had a name: William Earl Talbot II. On May 17, 2018, Talbot was arrested. Scharf's first call was to John Van Cuylenborg. He told him individual A was in handcuffs. John said it sent a chill down his spine, 31 years later. At the press conference, Jay's sister Laura spoke first. It's hard to put into words this feeling of relief, of joy, of great sorrow that this arrest brings. Leona Cook said what was at once a victory and a wound that would never fully close. On one hand, we're close to closure. On the other, we're still at a loss. I don't have my only son, Jay. The trial opened in Everett, Washington in June 2019, and it was never only about a 1987 double murder. This was the first trial in American history where a suspect identified through investigative genetic genealogy had been brought before a jury. CeCe Moore understood precisely how much was resting on the outcome. If the method was rejected, the precedent would follow. The defense argued on 2 grounds. First, that Talbot's DNA on Tanya's clothing was the result of consensual contact before her death, that someone else, unnamed and unproven, had committed the murders. Second, that the evidence as a whole was insufficient for a guilty verdict. Prosecutor Matthew Baldock dismantled the consensual argument directly. Tanya Van Cuylenborg was in a foreign country with her boyfriend of 6 months on a specific errand. Nothing about the circumstances of that night supported the claim she had voluntary contact with a stranger. More decisively, both Tanya and Jay were bound with identical zip ties. Both were murdered. 1 kit, 1 night, 1 killer. The defense's theory required an unnamed, evidenceless second perpetrator who happened to appear on the same night in the same area using the same restraints. Is it possible? Baldock said. Sure. Is it reasonable? No. On June 26, 2019, the jury left the courtroom to deliberate. John Van Cuylenborg had been waiting for a verdict since the night his father called him in college in 1987. Now he waited again outside a courtroom in Everett. The Cook family beside him, CeCe Moore watching from elsewhere, and Chelsea Rustad, the woman who had uploaded her DNA to find family and had ended up here. 3 days, 72 hours, in which 31 years compressed into something that still had no answer. On the 3rd day, the jury returned. June 28, 2019. Guilty. 2 counts of aggravated first-degree murder. I didn't do it, Talbot whispered from the defense table. He appeared stunned.
In July 2019, the judge sentenced William Earl Talbot II to 2 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. He was 56 years old. He had been 24 the night he crossed paths with Jay and Tanya. Cold case evidence covers breakthroughs like this one every week. If this story is reaching you, a subscription is the best way to make sure you don't miss the next case. December 2021. The families had believed it was done. They had been in the courtroom. They had heard the word. They had gone home with it. Then the Washington Court of Appeals overturned the conviction. Not because the DNA was rejected, not because genetic genealogy was challenged, because a juror, identified during deliberation as Juror 40, had told both prosecution and defense during jury selection that she wasn't certain she could remain impartial if violence had been committed against a young woman. She had been seated anyway. The court ruled the trial could not guarantee Talbot a constitutional, impartial jury. The verdict could not stand. For families who had already waited 31 years, the news arrived in the only way people with that kind of history can receive it. Not with shock, with exhaustion, with the particular grief of people who had finally set something down and were being asked to pick it back up again. December 23, 2022. The Washington Supreme Court, in a unanimous 9-0 decision, reinstated the conviction in full. The defense had possessed the legal right to remove Juror 40 before the trial began and had declined to use it. They could not appeal an outcome they have the tools to prevent. The 2 life sentences stood, final. Tanya Van Cuylenborg asked for his reaction. It never really brings closure or justice, but at least there's procedural justice. It feels better than if it had gone the other way. Chelsea Rustad attended Talbot's sentencing with the blessing of both families. She sat between Tanya Van Cuylenborg and Gordon Cook, Tanya's brother and Jay's father, 2 people she was meeting for the first time. She was the only member of Talbot's family present in that courtroom. Asked whether she felt any conflict, her DNA, her family tree used to convict her own cousin, she said simply, absolutely not, in light of the horrific nature of the crime. A woman who only wanted to know her own roots, sitting between a murdered girl's brother and a murdered boy's father at the sentencing of her own cousin. That image is what this case looks like when you hold all of it at once. This was the first criminal case in American history to result in a conviction through investigative genetic genealogy. After Talbot, CeCe Moore's method spread across the United States and beyond. The same GEDmatch technique had already been used weeks earlier to identify the Golden State Killer, Joseph James DeAngelo, arrested in April 2018. Jim Scharf said it plainly afterward, if it hadn't been for genetic genealogy, we wouldn't be standing here today. That statement belongs to every family that came after. William Talbot has never spoken about that night. No confession, no stated motive. Jay Cook's black ski jacket with the red piping has never been recovered. Tanya's olive day pack has never been found. The camera body, the one she carried onto that Last Ferry, the one she brought to capture something worth remembering, has never been found. The camera lens surfaced in Portland pawn shop in 1990, 3 years after the ferry. Someone had sold it. The camera body is still out there somewhere. On the afternoon of November 18, 1987, Jay Cook borrowed his father's bronze Ford van. Tanya Van Cuylenborg put the Minolta over her shoulder, the camera she brought because she wanted to remember their first trip together. The plan was ordinary: collect furnace parts, sleep in the van, drive home to Canada in the morning. They never reached the supplier. They never drove home. The photographs were never taken. What was left behind instead, a detective who could not close a file for 23 years, a complete stranger who built a family tree and accidentally broke a case that had defeated a generation of investigators, a method that changed how the world finds killers, and two families on Vancouver Island who waited 30 decades through the courts of a country not their own for a word that finally came in a courtroom in Everett, Washington. It took 31 years. It took a coffee cup. It took a woman who just wanted to know where she came from. And it changed everything that came after. If cold case evidence brought this story to you, subscribe. We cover cases that matter every week. Leave your thoughts on this case in the comments below.